As the Western Front turned more and more into a war of position after the Battle of the Marne in 1915, all sides tried to get the war moving again. In addition to gas, tanks, and days of artillery preparations, the Germans finally relied on a new unit with new tactics, the Stormtroopers. The heavy fighting on the Western Front was characterized on both sides by tens of thousands of men running against heavily fortified positions, which were defended by soldiers with machine guns and hand grenades. The use of gas and prolonged artillery fire also led to heavy losses on both sides, but a deep breach and a transition to a war of movement was rarely achieved. As a rule, large offensives with hundreds of thousands of casualties resulted in only minor gains in terrain. The first unit to use different tactics on the Western Front was Sturmabteilung Kalsow, which was formed from two pioneer companies. This unit was set up by the Prussian Army in March 1915 and was named after its leading major. In August 1915, Willy Rohr, who had been transferred from a Guards Rifle Battalion, joined the now renamed Guide Army Division. As the unit suffered heavy losses on the Loreto Front, it was detached from the front. From then on, Rohr took over the unit and began training it according to his own ideas. Although Rohr's tactical ideas were not new, they remained largely unnoticed. Rohr also equipped his unit with machine guns, and for the first time, the M15 steel helmet. He also relied on a new weapon. From 1912, Bernhard Redemann developed a terrible tool of destruction, which was used for the first time on February 26, 1915 at Malancourt before Verdun. Among the distraught prisoners taken during the attack was a French officer who had previously seen large parts of his unit die or flee. His only words were, "C'était l'enfer." That was hell. The weapon he witnessed being used was the flamethrower. It was to become the cruelest weapon in the Stormtroopers' arsenal. It was not without reason that the men of the Flammenwerfer Trupps Sturmbataillon No. 5 wore a skull and crossbones sleeve badge on their uniforms, and later also a skull and crossbones on their leather helmets. In December 1915, Rohr now had the opportunity to put his theories into practice. The Hartmannsweiler Kopf, a mountain in the Vosges Mountains that gave the dominant side a good view of the terrain, was fiercely contested during the war. Rohr was to test his theories here. Sturmabteilung Rohr was involved in the battles for Hartmannsweiler Kopf and was successful. So successful, in fact, that Rohr's unit was deployed to several sections of the front. The immediate superiors were satisfied. At the end of December 1915, several training courses were held in the presence of General of the Infantry Hans Guido. Rohr's tactics attracted more and more attention, especially as the fronts hardened even further. The German Supreme Army Command under Falkenhayn wanted to change this with the attack on Verdun. However, this major offensive soon became bogged down and turned into a bloodbath for both sides. This could now show what the new tactics could achieve. Rohr's assault unit was ordered to the front in front of Verdun, but this time Rohr's men were unable to make a decisive contribution. Quite the opposite. Due to the high losses of his unit, it was pulled out of the front line. According to Rohr's theory, his stormtroopers were supposed to advance quickly towards the enemy and take up the fight in the trenches as soon as possible. However, the newly assigned infantrymen under his command did not yet have the necessary experience in handling machine guns, light mine launchers, and, above all, close combat weapons. However, Army High Command 5 believed in Rohr's methods and ordered him to continue with the training, and the at least nominal commander of the Fifth Army, Crown Prince Friedrich Wilhelm Victor August Ernst, was also impressed and ordered the unit to be reinforced to form an assault battalion. The infantry quarters of Rohr's assault battalion were located in Bouvel, a small town on the French-Belgian border. In the nearby forest of Doncourt, the training battalion set up a training facility where thousands of German and Austrian officers were to be trained in modern infantry combat over the years. The Supreme Army Command initially ordered several Jaeger battalions to be detached from the front to be trained by Rohr. Like the sappers, the men of the Jaeger battalions were already used to decentralized command and did not find the tactical changeover to smaller squads difficult. In 1916, von Rohr's battalion was deployed again and again to focal points on the front. It was so successful that he reported to the Kaiser himself on the storming of the Souville Gorge. The so-called Souville Nose was an indentation in the German front line. It was created because the German troops were unable to advance further at this point during the ongoing Battle of Verdun due to French resistance. Rohr and some of his shock troops were finally deployed in this area, and on the morning of September 3, 1916, they succeeded in creating individual breach points in the clearing fog from which the remaining sections of the enemy front could be rolled up. On February 7, 1917, Rohr's Sturmabteilung received its famous name, Storm Battalion No. 5, Rohr. Although the first battalion of its kind, it was given the number 5 because of its affiliation with the Fifth Army. At this time, numerous assault battalions were already successfully deployed at the front. But let's go back a few years, because the Sturmtruppen tactics were not only devised by Rohr. During the Battle of Verdun, the French captain André Lafarque wrote several memorandums on infantry combat that were captured by the Germans. For example, he was of the opinion that troops should act self-sufficiently in smaller groups. These ideas were ignored by the French leadership, but the Germans gratefully accepted them. However, the Russians also used infiltration tactics of smaller combat groups during the Brusilov offensive in 1916. Due to the lack of artillery ammunition, they relied on short fire raids. The Austrians, for whom days of barrage fire announced an offensive, were surprised when infantry attacks by so-called shock troops took place after only a short bombardment. This tactic was very successful during the offensive. Ironically, because of their victories, the Russian High Command henceforth supplied Brusilov's troops with more ammunition. This led to a switch from short fire raids born of necessity to prolonged artillery preparation. This meant that the unintentional element of surprise was lost again. However, Oskar Emil von Hutier, Prussian infantry general, learned his lessons from the Brusilov offensive. Successful was a short but fierce and targeted fire preparation in combination with infiltration tactics. Another important figure who contributed his experience was the artillery officer Georg Bruchmüller. In his considerations, artillery was to take on another important task in addition to fighting enemy batteries: holding down the enemy infantry. This approach would complement the infiltration tactics very well. The own infantry was to reach the enemy trench unharmed under the protection of a fire roller moving ahead. In order to achieve the maximum effect, he divided his guns according to caliber size and range. Precise timetables were drawn up for this, which enabled the infantry to move only 100 meters behind the fire roller. Bruchmüller used this approach successfully for the first time on the Eastern Front in April 1916. In September 1917, Hutier's infiltration tactics and Bruchmüller's methods were used in combination. Some of the artillery rules Bruchmüller used, such as aerial photography to spot enemy targets, which made firing unnecessary, and the creation of complex time schedules, are still in use today. The use of these methods was a resounding success and ended with the capture of the city of Riga. Bruchmüller then began to combine his ideas with shock troop tactics and think them through further. He was responsible for further innovations that emerged from his perspective as an artillery officer. These included the use of battlefield artillery, such as infantry guns and mine launchers. This now allowed the infantry to independently and effectively fire on pockets of resistance. This was to have a major impact on the assault troops, which was to have a decisive effect in 1918. Since Rohr's first attempts, the number of assault battalions had steadily increased, and the weaponry had also become more diverse. In addition to flamethrowers, machine guns, such as the 0815 or the Madsen machine gun and grenade launchers, infantry guns such as the Feldkanone 16 were also used, as suggested by Bruchmüller. The soldiers were also equipped with numerous stick and egg hand grenades. Concentrated charges, in which several grenades were bound together, were also used in large numbers. The use of grenades was particularly important for the assault troops. It was not uncommon for individual soldiers in a squad to carry shoulder bags full of hand grenades and grenade-throwing training was an integral part of their training. Unlike the regular infantry, the assault troops used the Kar 98 AZ. However, small arms such as the Luger, the P-08, and the Mauser C-96 were also very popular. The later 18 submachine gun in particular was intended to significantly increase the firepower of the individual assault trooper in trench warfare. So you could say that the Stormtroopers were armed to the teeth. And for one purpose, the fire and shock power was to be increased to such an extent that breakthroughs into the enemy position could be achieved and extended. In addition to weapons, the Stormtroopers also used numerous tools, such as wire cutters to break through barbed wire obstacles, for example. They were also trained on enemy weapons so that they could use them if captured in battle. In 1917, assault battalions were no longer a rarity on the Western Front. They were repeatedly sent on particularly dangerous missions. In this year, the teams were officially given the designation Grenadiers. They were seen as following in the tradition of Frederick the Great's elite units and his guards infantry. Exceptions to this were the assault battalions number 3 and number 5, which emerged from the Jaeger and Pioneer battalions. Accordingly, their soldiers were called Jaeger and Pioneer. The soldiers in these units were not allowed to be older than 25, had to be unmarried, mentally and physically strong and athletic. As the war continued, however, it was no longer possible to adhere to these ideals. The Stormtroopers were supposed to put the enemy under pressure with their aggressive approach, and this way of fighting, although successful, led to high casualties. And not only in action, even during the exercises, which were kept as close to reality as possible, there were repeated fatalities. However, the Grenadiers spent less time at the front, received more pay, and were better fed. In 1918, shock troop tactics had developed steadily compared to their beginnings. While the initial focus was on storming enemy trenches, the tactics were integrated into larger operational plans in 1918. With the victory over the Russian Tsarist Empire, the Supreme Army Command under Ludendorff and Hindenburg set about planning the decisive blow on the Western Front. Operation Michael, which began on March 21, 1918, was to be a final effort to achieve a victorious peace after all. The Stormtroopers' finest hour had come. The battle began with an extremely fierce 5-hour fire attack. The three-phase system of artillery preparation devised by Georg Bruckmüller now came into full effect. In the first half hour, enemy troop concentrations and communication centers identified by aerial observation were bombarded with gas shells. The second 2.5-hour bombardment phase was aimed at holding down the enemy artillery and, at best, eliminating it. A mixture of explosive and gas shells was used. In the third phase, the assault troops advanced under cover of their own fire. In this phase of the war, some stormtroopers were particularly aggressive and sometimes stormed through friendly fire. Pyro signals were used to inform the artillery of their own position, and enemy positions were also marked in this way, and the fire could be shifted accordingly. For Bruckmüller, the use of gas was crucial, as gas grenades made it possible to hit larger areas and incapacitate troops. The previously developed Bundschassen was also used during Operation Michael. Different types of gas munitions were used. On the one hand, non-lethal gas, the so-called Blue Cross. These agents, which included tear gas, for example, were able to penetrate the gas masks, which is why they were also known as mask breakers. If the soldiers then tore off their masks, they were exposed to the other agents that were also fired. Green Cross was a lung-damaging agent, but it quickly dissipated so that the assault troops were not affected. The so-called Yellow Cross, which had an effect on the skin, was mainly fired at the flanks and the enemy artillery. Bruckmüller knew that no defense could be eliminated with artillery alone. The past 4 years of war had shown that, but his methods were able to paralyze the enemy, just long enough for the stormtroopers to start making breakthroughs. Unlike in previous battles, the stormtroopers had adopted a new tactic. Instead of rolling up trenches or destroying positions, they broke through the front at the weakest points and tried to advance into the rear as quickly as possible. Here they destroyed lines of communication and attacked the unprepared reserves. Typical of the Prussian military, the stormtroopers acted according to the order tactic, in which the units were given objectives. But the troop leaders on the ground could decide how to achieve these objectives, or whether there were more worthwhile targets depending on the situation. The general aim was to cause as much chaos and damage as possible behind the actual lines. The enemy units now sitting in their trenches were often cut off and attacked by the advancing German infantry following the stormtroopers. As they received no reserves, many of these positions were overrun while the stormtroopers continued to advance. In the last years of the positional war, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were sacrificed in month-long offensives to conquer just a few kilometers of land. With their new tactics, the Germans managed to break through a front 80 kilometers wide and 65 kilometers deep in 2 weeks, bringing them much closer to Paris. Ultimately, however, the German offensive was doomed to failure. Ironically, the nature of the defeat also lay in its success. Falkenhayn, who was still head of the Supreme Army Command in 1916, considered it crucial that lost territories had to be recaptured immediately, albeit with heavy losses. Ludendorff, who took over the Supreme Command together with Hindenburg after Falkenhayn's dismissal due to the defeat at Verdun, came from the Eastern Front. There it was not crucial to hold or conquer certain positions. Due to the size of the country, a more flexible strategy was possible, and retreats could also be used to one's own advantage, and attacks could be promising at several points on the enemy front. Although this idea contributed to achieving great tactical successes during the German Spring Offensive, the Germans got bogged down strategically and always shifted the focus of the offensive to the place that seemed most promising. As a result, they fought their way forward to the old battlefield on the Somme, and the breakthroughs became very dispersed. Too many tactical successes had been achieved, and they wanted to exploit them. The main thing was that the attack did not lose momentum. In short, the Germans neither had enough troops nor were they able to organize supplies sufficiently in the heavily destroyed areas. As a result, the advancing troops came to a standstill due to the great supply difficulties, and units began to loot the surrounding villages. There were even outright drunken brawls among the stormtroopers, who emptied every wine cellar they could find. The lack of reserves and better coordination among the Entente armies finally brought the offensive to a halt. Despite the huge losses and despite using up all their reserves, the stormtroopers had inflicted numerous defeats on the Entente troops. The Germans were to draw their conclusions from the tactics used in Offensive Michael and proceed in the same way 20 years later. Only this time they did not rely on the stormtroopers. A new unit was to dominate the battlefield and bring breakthrough tactics to bear at the operational level: the tank weapon.